Hey, welcome back to Conversations on the Porch. I'm Heidi and I'm here with my co-host Rattles.
Hey,
Hey,
everybody.
how's it going on that coast?
Oh, it's going great out here. We're starting towards spring. The crows are back. The swans are back. I'm just waiting for the vultures.
Very good. Well, we got bald eagles floating on the ice floes in the river, and we've got a
Nice.
snowstorm coming in. Not a
Uh-oh.
nor'easter, but a snowstorm. So
Uh-oh.
we're supposed to get about 5 or so inches today.
Does not sound like fun.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to the shoveling, but it looks pretty. All right, so the light's on. And we got a topic. One of the listeners from our last episode said that he was interested in hearing more about the work that you did um, when you were working with the Northern Irish issue. And so I thought that would be a good one to do next. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. I
Ready?
can I can go there. Um,
Right. So where should we start?
well, I think in order to understand the work that I was doing, you kind of have to have at least a very basic understanding of what the situation was at the
Okay.
time. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what was happening in the north of Ireland, and the biggest misconception is that Catholics were fighting Protestants. Um,
So,
and
I think that especially the younger people now, might not even know that there was a conflict. So, do you want to just start with what the conflict was, basically?
yeah, so the conflict in the north was about the constitutional status of six northern counties. So up until the 20s, Britain actually controlled Ireland.
And this is the 1920s, right?
Yes,
Okay, just clarifying because we're in the 2020s now. Yeah,
that's so we are. So
yeah.
we are. Um, and in 1921, I want to say, the Irish kind of won that war of separation. Um, but there was an agreement, there was a treaty that freed the most of Ireland from British rule, but left six counties behind because Britain would not sign a treaty that would make them lose the port of Belfast, which was a really big deal for them economically. So from that point on, you had a conflict. In fact, the person who negotiated that treaty said when he put his name to it, "I'm signing my death warrant," as he signed the document, and indeed he was, and he was killed for it later. Um, but from that point on, there has been conflict over what becomes of those six counties.
And so so essentially the politicians at the time sacrificed those counties in the north of Ireland in order to get the south of Ireland free from, so it's no longer part of Great Britain.
Right,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
All right.
And then the one of the big misconceptions is it's about Protestants versus Catholics. And
Okay.
that's a little bit complicated, but that is not what it's about. But
Isn't it
they
true though that most Irish are Catholic and most in the Northern Ireland are Catholic? Is that true?
no, well,
Okay.
it's no, it's actually not. It's
Okay.
actually not.
Okay.
So jumping back to the Industrial Revolution, they didn't intend to industrialize Ireland because that was such a great agricultural area. But ultimately, the factories were going to show up. And when they did, what happened was the British government, who controlled Ireland entirely at that time, um, when they brought factories in, those factories displaced the Irish farmers who were on those lands. And then to make matters worse, instead of hiring those Irish farmers and training them to work in the factories, they imported their own British already trained factory workers. So the native Irish were at that time were primarily Catholic. The factory workers who were brought in were British and primarily Protestant. So that's where that distinction is, but it doesn't mean that there aren't both on both sides of the line. Um,
Gotcha.
but then the native Irish were disenfranchised entirely because you had to own land in order to vote. So that became a big deal. But the important thing to kind of remember is that the descendants of those people who were brought in from England to staff the factories thought of themselves as British citizens. The native Irish think of themselves as not British, but Irish. And that's the distinction between the loyalists and the nationalists in the north of Ireland is you've got the descendants of those people who came in as British citizens and still generations later see themselves as British. And then you have the ones whose people have been in Ireland from time immemorial and see themselves as Irish, not British.
And this is a silly question, but can you tell the difference by looking at the people?
No,
I didn't think so. I just wanted to confirm. I didn't know if that was a misconception. Okay.
no. You can certainly tell the difference from where they live.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that where people live and what schools they go to and yeah,
So socioeconomically and and
and geographically.
neighborhoods and yeah.
Yeah,
Right. Okay, so we've got an issue that on the surface looks like it's Catholics against Protestant, but it's really not.
it's really
It's
not,
about
no. Except for one organization that's a very famous organization called the Orange Order,
okay.
and they are
Maybe
viciously
we'll
anti-Catholic.
yeah. Okay, so then so is that enough of the history? Is there a little bit more?
Just a little bit
Okay.
more that we can kind of skip past, there were some civil rights riots and some other things. Britain came in and began to militarily occupy the North. And that was a big issue.
And when was that about?
That was in the late 60s.
1960s, okay.
Yeah. So they came in and occupied with military force, which people began to protest and try to end because of the abuses that were being perpetuated on primarily the nationalist populations. And at a certain point, they began to
And
intern without charge people from men, particularly from nationalist neighborhoods, because they were of fighting age, would just get swept up and interned without charge.
okay, so let's slow down a little bit there. So I remember when I was first learning about this that loyalists and nationalists just sounded very similar. And so um, you said that, could you repeat a little bit about that when you said that the nationalists were swept up and interned without charge? And maybe talk about, just remind people of who the nationalists are and then talk about internment, what that means.
Nationalists see themselves as Irish. Loyalists are loyal to the British government.
Okay.
And then you also have unionists who are very similar to the loyalists. They're also on that side of the war, but we don't need to worry about them right now.
And so nationalists, I think nationalist Irish, loyalist British.
Yes.
That's how I have to keep it in mind.
Yeah.
Okay. Because
Yeah. Um, but the really important thing to the work I was doing in particular is that these men were interned without charge. They were
and
kept
and what do you mean by interned?
incarcerated, put in internment camps.
Okay. And an internment camp is it a prison?
Yes, after a fashion,
Okay.
just like the Germans did with Jews.
Mm-hmm. And the Americans did with Japanese
Yes,
Americans, Japanese
yes,
Americans.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
So not exactly a prison, but not welcome to leave.
Right. They called them the cages. They referred to them as the cages because they were open air, they were not cells, but they were
Okay.
cages. Um,
Okay. So young men were interned without charge.
Yes.
Okay.
And some of them were also taken as what they call special category prisoners. And special category meant prisoners of war taken from the conflict in the north of Ireland. So people who were not charged with murder or robbery or anything like that, they were arrested as POWs and they were called special category prisoners. So the really important thing for what I was doing is that in 1976, the British government instituted a new thing called the Criminalization Act. And they said, okay, special category no longer exists. You guys are now all criminals. Longcash internment camp was renamed to Her Majesty's Prison Maze. Cells were put in, and the what had been special category and POWs and internees were now considered under the law criminals. They were told they would have to wear prison uniforms, they would have to do prison labor. And that was
And and they also housed with criminal prisoners, or were they still segregated?
they were still segregated for the most
Okay.
part. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. But they were the internment camp was physically changed to a prison with cells,
Yep.
and they were required to be treated as criminal prisoners. And they chose many of them not to accept that designation. And as a result of that, you had the blanket protest because the British government said, fine, you don't have to wear the prison uniform if you don't want to, but you're not allowed to wear any other kind of clothes.
Okay.
So they were just forced to be naked. Um, and they were given a blanket for part of the day, so they wrapped in those blankets like robes, and that's why they were called the blanket men, or it was called the blanket protest.
Okay.
And so that was part of the issue there was that they weren't allowed toilet facilities, they weren't allowed clothing, they weren't allowed doctor visits without going through what was called a forced wash, where they put them in scalding hot water and scrubbed them down with deck scrubs. So needless to say, doctor visits didn't happen very often. They would hose them down after giving them their blanket for the night. They would hose them down to make sure their bedding was soaked in the winter. Um, I have a friend who had his feet broken twice in forced washes. Um, and that was all a result of the Criminalization Act.
Okay.
So a lot of the guys that I was dealing with were in Longcash. By the time I was dealing with them, those conditions didn't exist anymore because in 1981, 10 men died there on a hunger strike, and that sort of started a process of change.
Okay, I want to stop there for a second because you mentioned Long Kesh, and this is the first time you've mentioned that. Before you mentioned Her Majesty's Prison, the Maze. And so, what's the significance of
Okay, so like I
Long
said
Kesh?
before, Longcash internment camp was where they were kept.
Okay, okay,
That was renamed Her Majesty's Prison Maze when they
okay,
put cells in and put the H blocks in.
okay. And so, Long Kesh is
So
what the nationalists, nationalist POWs called their. That was the name of the internment camp.
yes,
Okay,
and
just making.
so to use one name or the other is a very political action from one side, either side.
Yeah.
Um, and
Okay.
for a long time, the British government said they would not accept any mail for prisoners if it didn't say HMP Maze on it. But as one of the POWs told me, every dog in the street knows where Longcash is, and the Brits finally gave up on that and would accept mail addressed to Longcash. So those were the guys that I was working with, was the ones who were some of them part of the blanket protest, and others that had come in later.
Okay. So blanket protests and then 10 men died. So um, is that because of the hunger strike or did they die on blanket? protest.
Yes, and yes, they were blanket men who died on the hunger strike. Yes,
Okay. And so when did the hunger strike start and why?
that was 1981. And then 2 years later, there was an escape of 38 men from the camp, and a lot of them got recaptured. Some of them were killed. Some of them were tortured. Some of them made it to the States, and the four that made it to the States were some of the people that I was working with. I was working with their legal cases, trying to get them political asylum here in the States. They were here for quite a while before they actually got discovered.
So um is that what got you interested in helping?
Yeah, essentially, I wasn't really aware. All the news that America got came from the BBC, of course. So I was not
Which is the
really
British
aware of that.
Broadcasting something corporation?
Yeah,
Just thinking for people who may not be familiar, young folks may or may not pay attention to that kind of news. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So I came into it with being completely politically ignorant, not understanding all of that history. Um, but yeah, so I learned a lot of that history from working with that group of POWs.
Um,
And most of what I was doing was prisoner support.
So when you say prisoner support, what does that look like?
Um, Keeping mail going in,
Okay,
watching
well stop, let's
situations.
stop right there. How, you're over here in Ellensburg, Washington. How could you help mail get in, you know, however 7,000 miles away?
I'm putting a stamp on it. Yeah, I mean, I just
Okay, so
send a lot of
literally, so
mail in.
you
Yeah.
so just mailing them things so that they would have incoming mail. So not facilitating getting mail in,
No,
but just
although sometimes that too, but no, I just started getting, and there's things about
you
situation,
were writing
monitoring,
letters.
yeah,
Okay.
and monitoring situations over there, because there are things that were just facts of life at that time, and one of those facts of life was
How are you?
you were less likely
Pretty
to
good.
fall down a set of stairs in
I'm
a flat
pretty
hallway,
good.
or get into a fight with another prisoner in solitary confinement if you were one of the POWs who was getting a lot of mail from America,
I'm pretty
okay,
good.
because they
And so
knew.
and I just want to make sure I heard that these were people who were less likely to fall down a set of stairs in a flat hallway than to get in a fight with another person when they were in solitary. Okay. I just wanted to make sure people heard that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
So
what was usually said when they would turn up
yeah,
battered.
yeah.
Um, so one of the ways to do that was when I knew somebody was in solitary, I would just get a bunch of postcards and send a postcard every day.
Okay.
That they would not be allowed to have those postcards until they got out of solitary, which could be months later. But I was not writing for them. I was writing for the censors who were going to read it. And and I would say things like, well, we know where you are. And so nobody's gonna believe it if you suddenly get into a fight in solitary over there.
Hmm.
And that was absolutely intended not for them, but for the censors to read,
Right. To put
um,
them on notice, kind of.
to put them on notice that America was watching, that there were
Yeah.
Americans watching that particular
Yeah.
POW.
Yeah.
Um,
So that was
so
quite a financial investment that you put in, if you think about it.
yeah.
I mean, nowadays it costs almost $2 to send a letter internationally. And
Mhm. Yeah, and I would put together, they fought me on it for the longest time because they kept saying, we don't need you to spend money on us. We just appreciate the support. But I would beg them to just send me like names of guys who like to play guitar or whatever, so that I could send guitar picks, or drawing pencils or little things for Christmas. And eventually they knew me well enough to know that I was going to send stuff anyway. So they would give me names and I would send in little packages and
Would they
stuff.
actually get them?
Sometimes depends. By the time I was working with it, most of it would get in. They were still doing things like it was hard to get a correspondence with an individual started because they would interfere. They would read those letters, see that it was the first time you were making contact, and they would try to prevent that first contact, so that you couldn't start, you couldn't get in touch with them. And then a lot of Americans in particular, it's like, well, if they don't get they don't understand what's going on. So if they don't get a letter back, they think, oh, well, he's in great here. I was trying to help this poor prisoner by writing a letter and he didn't even say thank you. It's like, yeah, that's an American thing. So I would just keep writing and eventually they would get one.
And so do you think that depended on the particular prison employee having a heart or
No, not really. Sometimes stuff just would get,
okay,
the default is to try to get, always to just hand out the mail by the time I was working with it, but
okay,
they would play games with it,
yeah,
do
okay.
stuff with it. And yeah, so I was doing a lot of that. And then I was also working with, a legal case for four guys who had escaped in the 1983 escape. And we were trying to get political asylum for them. So I was doing a lot of work with them.
And so they had come into the country without permission
Yes, they
or
absolutely came in unlawfully. And then, they stayed here for 9 years before they were discovered. And then when they were discovered, um, they didn't get into any trouble while they were here, other than being here unlawfully. But once they were discovered, then they got into the legal system, and it was really important for them to go through the legal system at that point and show that they were going to do what the legal system required them to do to get asylum.
so had they started the asylum process prior to being discovered?
No,
Okay, okay.
nope, they were just living under the radar. And then somebody reported one of them. Um, yeah,
And
and
so what kind of work did you do? Because I mean, I know you and I know you don't have a legal background. Um, so how did you learn the legal ropes and then what kind of things like tasks did you get involved in or what kind of things did you do?
um, part of it was PR. Part of it was reaching out to celebrities who might be willing to help. Reaching out, some of it was reaching out to congressional members who might be willing to help. I did a lot of that. Some of it was researching legal elements. At one point, the British government, it sort of they just sort of thought about the fact that they had never technically signed the second Geneva Convention, the second part of the Geneva Convention.
Mhm.
Um, so to correct that mistake historically, they signed it.
Mhm.
Um, and I got curious about what was in it and found out that what was in it changed everything with regard to POWs.
What was that it said that had the impact?
It redefined it redefined who POWs were. The original Geneva Convention happened during World War II when guerrilla armies were not recognized. So it only basically applied to people who were sort of taken while they were in uniform.
Mhm.
And the second part redefined that to include troops that didn't have uniforms and specifically troops that were fighting a military occupation of their country.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that was like one thing that I was able to put into the works for those four guys, was to say, okay, they were, at this point they're being held illegally anyway. And because of
And
because of how they were taken.
okay. And then the British military there was British military occupation in the north of Ireland. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and
So
another case
did that help
yeah, I think so.
in the case?
With the British, it did, yeah. Yeah. Another case I worked with, I looked at the psychological research of the cognitive effects of being confined in poor conditions, and was able to get some individuals who had been confined in some really bad conditions. And I suggested that their solicitors get them cognitively tested and work with that aspect that they were being held in conditions that were impacting them cognitively.
Mhm.
And at the time in Britain, the laws regarding the conditions in which they could be held were much less stringent than the laws that zoos had with regard to how the critters in the zoos could be held. And it was because that those were rules specifically being applied to only the nationalists.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, they couldn't have jury trials. That was another thing. Nationalists couldn't have jury trials.
Hmm. And
And
so it was judge in front of a judge only.
judge only, and also a signed confession would trump any other evidence. So if they could get them to, if they could coerce them into signing a confession, that would stand over anything else. And one of the guys who was that was over here that I was working with, the judge who oversaw his case, in his decision noted that there was no other evidence against him aside from his signed confession, but that the law allowed him to imprison him based on his signed confession in the absence of evidence.
What do they call that kind of trial?
Diplock court.
Diplock court. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
so you I remember you commenting on your experience with Americans who were in the various groups that you had connection with, sort of not being in it for the long game. But you stuck it out until the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit?
Beyond that, actually, as long as
Yeah,
until
that's
as
true.
long as they needed
Yeah,
me for prison work, I was there. But once the internment camp was closed, then I didn't really
yeah.
didn't help anymore.
So actually before that, and when if you need to talk about something else, let me know. But I remember you telling me a really interesting situation that Jerry Adams, and you'll have to explain who Jerry Adams is so I don't mess up the details, but that the British banned his voice from being aired publicly, and that his voice being allowed to be heard had a significant impact on things. And you could talk about that. And I think, given our interest in finding our voices and being willing to, speak up and things, um, I think that situation is really interesting.
Yeah, Bill Clinton, when he was president, invited Jerry Adams to come into the country and gave him a visa.
And could you
Invited,
explain to people who Jerry Adams is, his role?
yeah, I was getting to that, but so Jerry Adams is the head of Sinn Féin, which is an Irish political party, and it is the Irish political party most closely aligned with the nationalists movement. And Bill Clinton had invited him to come into the US and spend St. Patrick's Day here. And he had never been given a visa to the US. And the reason for that was because the British government and the American government have what they call a special relationship. And so, because the British government would have been unhappy, no American president had given him a visa, but Bill Clinton did. And that impacted actually a number of things, but in the good thing that it did was it allowed the world to hear his voice for the first time, and that allowed the nationalist side to be seen a little more accurately for the first time, and really directly led to the Good Friday Agreement that ended the current phase of the what they called the Troubles. Um, the downside of it for the work I was doing was that the British government became extremely angry over it. John Major was the prime minister at the time, and he was furious, and he threatened that he would cut off the so-called special relationship. And Clinton was in an interesting dilemma because it was an election year. And when he had said Jerry Adams could come over, Irish America just rose up in his favor. And Irish America is pretty big, and that was a big voting bloc. But so he didn't feel like in that election year he could take it back. On the other hand, Britain was furious, and so Clinton had to give them something to sort of settle the situation down. And so what Clinton gave them was my friend Jimmy, who had already been given political asylum. And so he was taken out at 3 a.m. and shipped back to the north of Ireland and put into Maghaberry prison, where he was immediately tortured. And before he was eventually transferred back to Longcash, to Kishvada. So yeah, that Adams coming to America had a direct effect on that case too, but not necessarily the kind of effect that Adams would have wanted it to have.
Right. And so how long did it take from, I mean, ballpark, from the time that Jerry Adams came over here to the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, it took a year or so to hammer it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've covered a lot. Is there anything else that you think people would be interested in hearing or might need to know to understand?
I think that probably kind of covers, I mean, there was a lot of work, and it was a lot of frustrating work. I guess the one thing that I want people to get out of it, I would never in a million years have thought that we would see Longcash internment camp closed in my lifetime. I mean, that's the goal that I was working for, but I didn't expect to see it in my lifetime. I thought it would be something that I was working for, something that another generation would finish. But it happened.
Thanks to
So
people like you.
yeah, I was just a little tiny part of it, but one
Yep.
person is one person, and you get
Yep.
enough one persons and you get a movement.
Yep. And you always tell me when you say one rattlesnake or one Mormon cricket, it mattered to that one individual. And I think in this
Yeah.
case, that one individual mattered in this big picture.
Yeah.
So what kind of resources might be of interest to people who want to learn more about the issues, more about the details of um, the nationalists?
I don't have the web address right now, but Google the Bobby Sands Trust.
Okay, the Bobby
Bobby Sands
Sands.
was the first of the hunger strikers to die. He was the one who organized the hunger strike, and he was the first to die on it. And he
And that's
was,
Sands,
yes,
Sands. Okay.
yeah. And he was quite a writer. So during the blanket protest and the hunger strikes, one of the things they weren't allowed to have was toilet paper. Another thing they weren't allowed to have was anything that you could write on or write with. But in Long Cash, they had sort of a stub of a pencil and the inner workings of a ballpoint pen that they were able to hide and move around from one person to another. But Bobby was always allowed to have it for longer because he was a writer. And his sister and others would smuggle toilet paper in. And so most of the writings that you can read of his, when you read them, keep in mind that they were smuggled out on scraps of toilet paper. to the outside world. And
Yeah.
if you want to know what it was like to be in Lancaster and the hunger strikes and the blanket protest, absolutely take a look there and read Bobby's own accounts of it.
Yeah. Wow, that was a great lesson. And I know I've heard it all before, but it was really interesting to hear it again. Yeah.
Hmm.
All righty. So we heard the listeners out there. So if you have another topic that you'd be interested in hearing, otherwise you'll get our favorite history lesson or life lesson or whatever else strikes us. So shall we flip the light off?
I think we should.
All righty. So
But before we turn
lights.
the light off, let me just
Okay.
say one more time, Lancaster internment camp is gone. Those people are
Oh,
free. Because I don't want to
yeah,
leave it. I don't want to leave it on smuggling stuff on toilet paper because that's a little dark.
that is a
So
little dark.
so
Yeah.
let's before we shut the light off, let's turn the light on for just a second and say all of those men are free
Mhm.
and um, they won. Ultimately, we won. And Bobby Sands had famously said, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." So
Yeah.
we'll leave it there with a little bit of light on before we turn the light off. And now I think we can
Yeah.
turn it off and head on in.
Okay. Yeah, with the idea of the laughter of children. That is a great way to end. All righty. Well, I will stop there and we'll see you next time.